Today I'm going to talk about pyrophilic insects, and I'm going to try and make the case that they should be recognized as their own distinct community of insects. This is a topic that isn't directly part of my thesis, but it's one that I've been reading a lot about during this past year in isolation. And the sole objective of my presentation is to hopefully introduce you to a group of organisms you might have never heard about, and to invite you down the rabbit hole of pyrophilic insects. Fire is an important disturbance agent across Canada, and it occurs pretty much anywhere that there is sufficient vegetation to fuel it. This is a map of annual area burned in Canada, and you can see that northern Saskatchewan and up into the Northern Territories is a major hotspot for fire. If we look at the provincial scale and focus on the area north of the Churchill River, we see that quite a bit of the land area has all burned within the last 70 years. So this is a snapshot of Cree Lake, and the colored polygons represent the area burned by fire. Darker colors like black and red represent recent burns, whereas the greens represent fires dating back to the 80s and prior. And as you can see, there's very little area that hasn't been burnt in the last 70 years, and this is in part because fire suppression is relaxed north of the Churchill and only comes into play if a fire threatens a community. And although our relationship with fire is a tenuous one, we know that recently burned sites offer a lot of value to wildlife. When the forest canopy is removed by fire, we see a regenerative pulse in trees, shrubs, and a wide variety of vascular plants, and there's also an abundance of deadwood. These burnt areas are used by bears looking to fatten up on berries, elk and other cervids for browse on the new growth. We find some rare vascular plants in Saskatchewan like orchids, and there's an abundance of dead wood for saprophytic insects, which are insects that feed on dead or dying trees, and many of the grubs and larvae laid in the burnt trees provide food to woodpeckers and other birds. Although fire still burns a large amount of area in Canada each year, the rise of industrial forestry in the 20th century means that harvesting now competes with fire for forest resources. So we don't clear cut forests anymore, and we instead harvest in a way that tries to mimic natural disturbance patterns like fire. And this is done by leaving small clumps of standing trees or patches of intact forests at the harvesting site, similar to the dead wood and snags from fire skips that would be left behind by a fire. And the idea here with retention harvesting is that if you maintain some of these legacy structures, you can harvest in a more sustainable way that emulates natural disturbances like fire. So if we look at a typical retention cut block like this one, um, I might be oversimplifying things a bit here, but you can imagine that many of the habitats typically available in a burnt site are provided by this type of harvesting. So browsing for ungulates, berries for bears, open canopy, etc. But are we missing anything by actually eliminating fire? Well, if you're a species that is dependent on exploiting recently burned habitats, then the answer is yes. This is a subset of pyrophilic insects that have sensory organs capable of detecting infrared radiation that is emitted from a forest fire. In Melanophila beetles, the sensors are located in a pair of mesothoracic pits, so the middle of the six legs. And they consist of bundles of small dome-like structures. Infrared passes through a small hole at the tip of these dome-like structures, causing the underlying cavity to expand with heat, which in turn triggers an action potential and a response from the beetle. And the location of these structures, of these sensors, is different between the different insect groups. So in Merimna atrata, they're located on the second, third, and sometimes the fourth abdominal segments, here with the yellow arrows. In Aratus bugs, they're dispersed all over the prosternum, whereas in Acanthonemus, they're confined to two prothoracic discs with tiny hairs that pick up on the infrared signal. So the different location and the different functional properties of these organs, sensory structures, suggest that they evolved independently. And although they were originally thought to help in the detection of distant forest fires, there's now more conclusive evidence that they're actually used by insects to avoid hotspots when they arrive at an active fire. So this is the approximate number of pyrophilic species, although not much is known about the actual life history of many of these insects. So about 30 species of flies, 40 beetles, 10 species of bugs, and a couple moths and a single wasp so far. And the values in brackets on the right are from a 1997 paper by Wickers, which was sort of the first attempt at putting together a comprehensive list, whereas the values on the left represent a new count, including additional species that I think should qualify as pyrophilic. And the reason it's an approximate count is it's really hard to define exactly what constitutes a pyrophilic insect. So to illustrate why, consider these two species for a second. So the longhorn beetle on the left, Monocamus scutulatus, is attracted to fire and will reproduce in burnt sites. But it's also attracted to a wide variety of other disturbances that kill trees. So wind throws, clear cuts, insect outbreaks, things like that. In contrast, the beetle on the right is one of the Melanophila I showed you a few slides ago with infrared receptors. And experiments with its larvae suggest that it can only fully develop in burnt logs, possibly because healthy trees put up too much of a host defense response. So Melanophila won't show up at just any disturbance. You might find a stray individual here and there, but its primary habitat is in recent burns. So, not all insects arriving at fire are the same. Some are tourists, in other words, facultative pyrophiles, and others are completely dependent on fire, obligate pyrophiles. So if we don't make this distinction between disturbance-adapted and fire-dependent species, it can lead to some misleading conclusions. So this is a paper from 2008 by St. Germain et al. Titled Persistence of Pyrophilous Insects in Fire-Driven Boreal Forests, Population Dynamics in Burned and Unburned Habitats. So right away they make reference to pyrophilous insects, but in the body of the paper repeatedly refer to disturbance-adapted species like Monocamus. We've already discussed how that could be problematic. So in their study, they used models of age class distribution and deadwood availability to show that the amount of deadwood is actually highest in areas with prolonged absences of fire. So abundance of deadwood on the y-axis here peaks within this red box. And because deadwood is important to pyrophilic species, here I'm using air quotes, they conclude the low connectivity between fire events and the typical life cycle seen in these species make it improbable that recent burns act as a significant population source. This leads us to suggest that populations of pyrophilous species may be more limited by the adequacy of the unburned matrix than by the occurrence of fire events. So they kind of lumped everything under the umbrella of pyrophilic insects and made some pretty bold statements with respects to deadwood. But even their deadwood model is a little suspect to me. This is some data from my PhD sites that span a chronosequence of time since fire from 4 to 200 plus years. And my data show that the biggest spike in deadwood is actually immediately after the fire. So again, here on the x-axis we have time since fire, and then on the y-axis we have volume of deadwood. And I further split the data into logs that were charred, in other words charcoal present, in black here, the black line, and those which hadn't obviously been burned by fire. So it shows quite clearly that the pulse of deadwood, in my sites at least, is mainly from the fire. So all around, kind of a frustrating paper, but a good example of why pyrophilic insects should be distinguished from other disturbance-adapted species. But still, what characteristics distinguish pyrophilic insects from your run-of-the-mill disturbance-adapted species? We know that infrared receptors are known from a few species, and we know that simply being attracted to fire isn't unique to pyrophilic species. We also see, opportunistic instances of vertebrates showing up at fire and things like that. But what other characteristics define pyrophilic species? And what I've found is generally that quantitative data is lacking. Many of the studies on pyrophilic species often occur a year after fire. But there's actually a treasure trove of qualitative data from many of these observational studies. So, one of the characteristics from reading through these observational studies that's become apparent to me, this one actually has some data behind it, but um, often while the fire is still active, these beetles show up in large numbers and then disappear rather quickly within a short period of time. So this is data collected from observations of a single tree after a fire in Australia, and Schmitz et al. Worked with firefighters so they could get into the area safely while the ground was still hot. And what they found was Merimna atrata showed up immediately to the site while the fire was still active, but abundances peaked in the first day and then sort of declined towards the third day, with most beetles having disappeared by the fourth day. And this pattern of quickly appearing, reproducing, and then disappearing until the next generation emerges is a unifying theme across many of these species. A second characteristic is that they arrive in large numbers at burn sites and are only rarely seen in habitats not associated with fire. So on the left here is a smoke fly from the genus Microsania. They assemble in mating swarms in the plumes of smoke given off by fire. And prior to the discovery of their attraction to smoke in the 1920s, they were considered very, very rare. In fact, only 6 specimens were known from all of England in 1934. Another story that kind of illustrates how rare these species can be outside of their main habitat is from a naturalist by the name of Kessel. He was a guy who collected diptera or flies all along the west coast, and he set out on an expedition to find these flies in the 1940s. So he went to the only place in California where they'd been previously recorded, did a bunch of collecting in the area, and came up empty-handed. Then he returned home to his house just north of San Francisco, fired up his barbecue, and lo and behold, dozens of these flies were attracted to the smoke given off from his barbecue. So these species have very narrow habitat specificity. A third characteristic, and one I've alluded to a little bit in the slide about infrared receptors, is these species are capable of handling extremely hazardous conditions typically found at a raging forest fire. So the great grandfather of crabidology, Eric Lindroth, describes an instance of collecting Saracota in British Columbia, where he saw them flying towards a raging forest fire and settling on the hot ashes. And this adaptation allows them to invade fires very quickly while the fire is still pretty hot. So lastly, one of the main reasons they seek out fire is for reproduction. And one of the reasons they might do this is due to the availability of sterilized substrates. So forest fires can easily exceed 700 degrees Celsius, which is capable of killing pretty much anything in the soil or wood, which would act as a main oviposition site for many of these insects. Based on the years of working with the Merimna atrata, Schmitz et al. Talk about how they have never seen eggs that were deposited in unburnt portions of the tree. And to give you an idea of how inhospitable some of these egg-laying substrates can be in the absence of fire, this is a study by Heeson on Pterosticus oblongopunctatus, which is a commonly occurring ground beetle in Europe with no affiliation to fire. And what they found was eggs laid on fresh litter from the beetle's habitat had a mortality of about 70%. When that litter was heated in a container to 70 degrees and then used as an egg-laying substrate, egg mortality dropped to 7%, even after the microsite selection from female beetles. So the females were deciding where to lay these eggs. So this might explain how they achieve such high abundances in many of these burnt sites, and also why there's been such a strong selection pressure to find these burnt sites quickly before they can be colonized by other things. So a major increase in survival rate in eggs laid in relatively sterile substrates. So quickly to conclude, fire-dependent insect species possess a variety of adaptive characteristics for exploiting recently burned habitats. These characteristics set them apart from more general disturbance-adapted species like Monocamus that are attracted to the fire on a more opportunistic basis. And harvesting practices that seek to mimic natural disturbance patterns that don't use fire will probably not conserve fire-dependent species. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.